Hi, good evening, everyone. I am State Representative Deanne Mazzochi for Illinois House District 47. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know that we have people joining us first here on the Zoom call, as well as through Facebook Live. So I do want to thank everybody who's taken the time out of your busy schedules to sit down and chat with us for tonight as I give you a little bit of a Springfield update, and then also try to answer as many questions as I can in connection with the issues that you care about, what's going on in Springfield, and the various things in which state government is impacting you. So one of the things that I do have for everyone tonight is I do have some slides. So I'm going to go ahead and pull those up. And as we're getting those slides started, I do want to let everyone know if you have questions on Facebook for Facebook Live, we do have someone monitoring the feed. So go ahead and put some questions in there. Also, if you're here attending through the Zoom call, we do have the Q&A button. Please try to use the Q&A button, not the chat function. And if you use the Q&A button, number one, that ensures that your questions can be anonymous. They're not going to be shared with all the rest of the members of the group, but also it will make it easier for us to manage everything and make sure that we can go through and get all of your questions answered in the order that they appear. So I do want to start off. I'm State Representative Deanne Mazzochi, and I'm here to give you an update on where we are in terms of some of the big issues that have been going on in Springfield and some of the things that we're expecting we are going to see during the upcoming legislative session. So if we can jump to the next slide. First, I want to recap for you some of the major pieces of legislation that were passed last year. We actually had a pretty lengthy lame duck session in January of 2021, and the spring session, in addition to a spring session, as well as a fall veto session. So the way in which things work in Illinois is, yes, we can have a lame duck session before new members are seated. Or at the end of one session before the next one starts. We also have what's called a veto session. So that usually comes up in November. If we can jump to the next slide, the veto session usually comes up in November, October-November time period. And usually that's there so that if the governor vetoes any legislation, the legislature can come back and decide, are we going to override it? Or are we going to accept amendments if the governor put amendments in? But in reality, the fall veto session wound up being a time to try to, again, ram through some additional legislation and clean up some other pieces of legislation that got passed that also had problems. Now, the main piece of legislation that you may be hearing about, it's being called criminal justice reform. I'm not sure that it's a reform that I usually think of reform as having some good connotations. I was very concerned about this piece of criminal justice legislation because one of the main centerpieces for it is to end cash bail starting in January of 2023. So currently, our judges do have some discretion to set bail amounts, based on somebody. It can be based on someone's means. It can be based on the severity of the crime, and it can be used as an alternative to electronic monitoring, which is, pretty much the only other method that we have for pretrial detention, aside from actually putting someone in, having actual pretrial detention at one of the local prison within the prison system. And what this is essentially saying is that we're not going to require people to post a bond to appear for a whole host of different crimes. I voted against that because in other states, and particularly in Chicago, where there was a pilot program that started in 2017 to try to reduce or minimize cash bail or expand the use of certain types of diversion programs. Some of them can be successful. A lot of them haven't been. It's actually led to an increase in crime, and we're seeing a lot of that now in DuPage County. Personally, I think it's going to get even worse once this legislation goes into effect in January of 2023. Another big piece of legislation related to it was referred to as another green energy package. We have a situation in Illinois where some of our nuclear plants were actually potentially on the verge of shutdown. That's actually not good for the district that we live in because 80% of the electricity that we generate in the northern Illinois region where we live is generated through nuclear power, and in terms of turning your lights on and that sort of and running industry. This is going to basically create some additional wind and solar energy subsidies in addition to changing some of the pricing structures for some of our other energy delivery, and it's going to have a price tag for an average, low-level residential consumer of about $657 a month, and there's always a risk that pricing can continue to increase. Another big issue that was being pushed related to parental notification in connection with an underage child, your daughter trying to get an abortion. So in Illinois, we have not had in law for a very long time any requirement that parents actually give consent to their minor child receiving an abortion. However, several years ago we did, and it was actually subjected to a lot of challenge and litigation, and it was finally blessed by the courts to say, yes, it was appropriate to notify a parent, not both parents, at least a parent, that their underage child was going to be having an abortion. And the reason behind that was twofold. Number one of the things that we found in Illinois is that when it comes to underage sex trafficking, it's not uncommon that those women will be directed towards the abortion clinic. And those are actually instances where the parental notification law has allowed the state of Illinois to actually catch people who are engaging in trafficking. Another related issue is that from a parent's point of view, and I say this as a parent of a daughter, if your daughter does go through this procedure, there are certainly risks that can happen if there were to be a late subsequent infection or something along those lines. If you as a parent want to know, does my child need immediate medical care? Notification that she did go through an abortion procedure is going to help you make sure that your child, your daughter can stay safe. But unfortunately, the Democrats voted, it was party line vote in favor of it. There were actually bipartisan votes against it, and the governor is signing it. Limiting the Illinois Right of Conscience Act. The Illinois Right of Conscience Act was actually drafted very broadly to essentially give you not only rights, but also a remedy to go after individuals who were trying to force you to undergo certain medical procedures, or for people working in the healthcare industry who are being asked to participate in medical procedures where they had a conscientious objection to the procedure being performed. Governor Pritzker, this was one of his very big initiatives in the veto session, was to essentially strip your right to object based on conscience rights in connection with things such as COVID-19 vaccine mandates. This was a hugely contentious issue. And in fact, as a legislator, one of the things that we get in connection with pieces of legislation is when there are people who are opposed, you can file witness slips. There were, I believe, over 60,000 witness slips that were, filed in opposition. Certainly our office, we received hundreds, if not thousands of phone calls from people and emails from people who were objecting to, eliminating people's rights of conscience. And unfortunately, that didn't matter to the majority party or to the governor. And that also got signed. And interestingly, because there were so many Democrats who were opposed to passing this legislation, if you want to pass a piece of legislation during the veto session that's going to have an immediate effective date, it actually increases the threshold of votes that you need to have to get it to pass for an immediate effect. Because they didn't have the votes for that, they changed it to have an effective date of June 1st, 2022. So, at the very least, we'll certainly have some additional cases and court proceedings and additional facts and data that hopefully will lessen the need or the adverse consequences of removing people's rights of conscience. But I strongly opposed eliminating the Rights of Conscience Act. I don't believe that. I think that government is in a dangerous place when you're asking people to violate their sincerely held beliefs. Another big piece of legislation that was being pushed by the teachers unions and various political activist groups is revising the sex ed standards. These are highly age inappropriate, and they're going far beyond just providing individuals with, particular facts. In fact, one of the doctors who spoke against these particular sex ed standards call them analogous to trying to groom children for sexual exploitation. Fortunately, you as a parent do have the right to opt out of this curriculum, but to me, it's actually very disturbing that this is something that the Democrats decided to put a lot of their time and attention behind, particularly when there's so many other issues that are pressing for Illinois. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, but I do want to address one of the questions that came up. What are some of the alternatives proposed in lieu of cash bail? The answer right now is nothing. The particular piece of legislation essentially said you cannot have cash bail. Now, there are things that judges can still do, for example, such as electronic monitoring and telling someone that they are subjected to home confinement. One of the issues, though, that always arises with that is how good is the compliance going to be with electronic monitoring? I don't know if some of the individuals who are participating in the call tonight remember that there was a home break-in in Lombard, where a family was attacked, and it turned out that it's the alleged perpetrators. At least one of them was actually out on electronic monitoring. And the cases are legion, where you can find all sorts of areas where violent felonies are taking place here in Illinois, particularly in the Cook County and surrounding Collier counties, where people are committing more violent crimes even though they are currently on electronic monitoring. We've also seen instances as well where legislation has been passed, again, not legislation that I voted for, where if you are on electronic monitoring and it's determined that you're not where you're supposed to be in your home surveillance environment, that the police can't do anything until you're out of touch for 48 hours. So I'm sure you can imagine that gives all sorts of opportunities for people to, again, go ahead and engage in criminal activity. And there's literally nothing that the police, or in some instances, even the courts, can do. When we did go down to Springfield last week, we were there for a day. One of the things that it was very surprising to us related to redistricting in connection with the judges in DuPage County. But let me just kind of give you a general recap on what's happened with regard to redistricting. So in Illinois, every 10 years after the U.S. Census gets taken, at the federal level, there is a reapportionment of congressional seats based on population. Unfortunately, because Illinois has been losing population, we are losing a congressional seat. And in addition, there's not only then redistricting of the congressional seats, but also of the state legislative seats as well, so that we can have a balanced population for both the Senate and the House seats. Unfortunately, the Democrats, when it came to the district here that we all live in, District 47, they specifically said we are going to gerrymander these maps. And the reasons why they did that were to, quote, maximize political power and increase the partisan advantage for Democrats and their incumbents. And District 47 is now going to become District 45. If you would like to see that repeated in print, you can find it. I've got the citation here. You go to ilga.gov and you look for House Resolution 443. The second version, which is the one that actually was adopted. And if you want to see how our district has changed based on precincts and census tracts, you can find that at page 70 of the legislation. And you can also find the express statement that the district boundaries were being changed in order to give Democrats a partisan advantage. I like to think that I'm representing you well down in Springfield and, making sure that I'm representing your interests, not a political machine's interests. And apparently that's not a very popular viewpoint down there, which is why they're trying to gerrymander the district. So I apologize. Another issue then, because these were pretty severely gerrymandered maps, and not only gerrymandered for partisan advantage, but also in connection with compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. One of the things that is very clear under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is you are not supposed to be, changing districts in a way that is going to be harming districts that are certain communities of interest, particularly with regard to, race, And again, if you look through HR 443, you'll see all sorts of areas where, for example, historically African-American neighborhoods that normally vote as a block and have a community interest in trying to make sure that they're able to get people, who genuinely represent their interests elected down in Springfield. Those neighborhoods were cracked and split apart so that they could go help, for example, Robin Gable, who represents the Evanston area, and and other areas such as, for example, as in the Metro East St. Louis area. Those districts which were historically African-American districts, were split up and to try to help white Democrats maintain their partisan advantage. In addition, one of the things that we have seen here in Illinois is that the Latino population has been growing and growing and growing. But unfortunately, the number of districts and the representation for Latino districts have not been showing up in Springfield. So one of the things that we pointed out, so both the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, the NAACP, as well as our caucus sued the Democrats in federal court, pointing out that, for example, here in DuPage County, there are at least two areas where you could potentially create Latino communities of interest that would allow more Latinos to get elected to office. Additional areas in Chicago, additional African-American seats that could be protected in various areas. And unfortunately, the federal court said that they actually were going to allow that to slide because the Democrats were using as their excuse not racial animus, but the desire to gain partisan advantage. Another area where, for the first time, we've seen partisan politics entering the judicial branch, at least in terms of our generation, is the judicial boundaries have been changed for the first time for the Illinois Supreme Court since they were implemented in 1964. And again, there was a redistricting bill that just came out last week from Springfield. We had no notice of it. And for DuPage County, now to be clear, nobody, the sponsor of the bill, she admitted, nobody from DuPage County asked for these gerrymandered sub-districts for judicial elections. Nobody asked for it from the county board. Nobody asked for it from the state's attorney's office. And in fact, the caseload overall for judges in DuPage County has been going down. So the question was, so why are you doing this? And the answer was diversity. The real reason is, again, Democrats are going to use that to try to bring more what I would call judges in the Cook County mold into DuPage County. And that, again, is rather unfortunate because I think one of the reasons why DuPage County has been doing so well comparative to Cook is because we have high quality judges who believe in enforcing the law and keeping our streets safe. And unfortunately, I think that there's a movement within the Democratic Party to have that change. But if we can go to the next slide, some of the other proposed legislation that I've certainly been working on, if we can move forward, various issues relating to election integrity. Now, one of my favorite pieces of legislation that I am constantly bringing up to the Democrats is this. Currently under state law, now it'll actually give you some background. Now there is a joke that in Cook County, you can go to the cemetery to collect votes. And one of the reasons why we unfortunately have that reputation of dead voters, and we even saw this in the last election where the clerk's office admitted that there were people who applied for mail-in ballots using the names of people who were deceased. Is because in the state of Illinois, when we are talking about maintaining our voter rolls, we say that the county clerk may take the dead people off the rolls, not that they shall take dead people off the rolls. And, to me, particularly if in Illinois, there's a desire to try to increase the use of mail-in balloting. We've certainly seen that from the majority party. You can't do that if you don't have completely squeaky clean voter rolls, because otherwise all you're doing is you're creating an invitation for voter fraud. Another issue, so that's one of the issues that I have been working on, and it's very telling that the Democrats, simply will not agree that we must take dead people off our voter rolls. Reoffender tracking has been another issue. Again, because one of the things that we've seen as a result of prior efforts to do bail reform is that, we see criminals failing to appear in court when they, or, people who are, who are out on bail, or on electronic monitoring, they actually don't show up for their court hearing. And in some instances, here in Illinois, the penalty for failing to show up for your court hearing is far, far less than the consequence of, engaging in the criminal activity yourself. So, we've got this perverse situation where you have people who are incentivized to flee, either flee the jurisdiction or flee the state. That's obviously not a good thing. So I have some pieces of legislation related to that. Small Cell Wireless Facilities Act. A lot of you may be seeing TV commercials about the wonders of 5G technology. Unfortunately, there also are some downsides that accompany 5G technology, including that all of a sudden you might find a nasty hornet's nest of cell towers suddenly in your backyard or in your front lawn that you didn't expect. And this, again, is an area where, unfortunately, property owners have been given short shrift in terms of being able to control, what major utilities get put, not only in their parkways, but in their backyards. And that's something I'm going to continue to work on. Ethics reforms. There's a whole host of issues going on with ethics. I actually served on the Special Investigation Committee for Mike Madigan. I'm very glad I served on that committee because I think some of the testimony that came out is what led to Mike Madigan's eventual ouster from his Speaker of the House position. And then once he was no longer able to be Speaker, he left the House of Representatives. But there's still so much more that we need to get done in Illinois. Property tax relief. This is something that I've filed multiple pieces of legislation on. And I know that there are also some individuals, including, one who's on tonight, who has been trying to seek property tax relief. A few years ago, when I first joined the legislature, the Democrats made a big fuss over they were going to have a property tax relief task force. And we had hours and hours of taking testimony and having meetings and pieces of legislation, and not a single one of them has been allowed to move forward. And in fact, on the House side, I even had two Democratic bills that I picked up from the Senate that related to trying to just make it easier for disabled veterans to be able to keep certain of their property tax exemptions. And the committee chairman and the Speaker of the House have been adamant they are not doing any property tax bills this year. So maybe we'll see something, maybe somebody will change their mind. But unfortunately, it's just not been a priority on the Democratic side of the aisle. Unemployment fraud prevention. One of the big pieces of issues that was coming up related to unemployment fraud. Our office was inundated with calls with people who either got letters in the mail saying they had applied for unemployment insurance and they hadn't, people who were trying to get their benefits and couldn't. And the Illinois Department of Employment Security has just been an administrative mess and nightmare. I will say, if you do get any of those types of letters or need help, please, please, please call my office. We have become expert at trying to get through to at least a live body at the Illinois Department of Employment Security to try to make sure that we can, at least get follow-up and status on what's going on with these types of things. But again, this is an area where I filed legislation because to apply currently for unemployment insurance benefits, we don't even have online, we don't even have dual factor authentication, which to me, that's such a basic security procedure in pretty much any private sector thing. It's ridiculous that we haven't put in some of these rudimentary security measures for online applications at the state level. And while I get that the state is, saying they're trying to improve them, that's unfortunately a cold comfort for the people who, are at risk of identity theft and a whole host of other issues. And ultimately, property tax relief, one of the things that is driving up your property taxes over and over and over again, you see it in your school bills, you also see it in your local communities, property tax levies, is the state keeps on imposing all sorts of unfunded mandates on our schools, on our municipalities. It's very convenient for the state. They say, we want your school district to go do something. And the school district says, great, can you give me some money so I can carry that out if you think it's so important? And the answer that the state gives is no, go do it yourself. For a school district like ours, that inevitably leads to higher property taxes. Other pieces of legislation I'm working on in connection with the next slide. And by the way, you can find all these pieces of legislation at the Illinois General Assembly website. So I remember it is ilga.gov. So www.ilga.gov. If you go there, go to the House, click on members, and then you can actually see a list of all the legislation and pretty much, and anything where if you click on, where I am the primary sponsor, those are all pieces of legislation that I've drafted. So I have legislation relating to lowering prescription drug costs, a fair map constitutional amendment, housing to try to keep people in their homes, red light cameras. So many of you have reached out to my office complaining about the red light cameras, particularly the one that was the subject of the federal indictment involving former state senator Martin Sandoval, which is located at Route 83 and 22nd Street. It's not Oak Brook. It is Oak Brook Terrace who has installed that particular red light camera. In fact, the mayor of Oak Brook Terrace was referenced within the indictment as someone who may have accepted bribes in connection with the installation of that camera. I have done pieces of legislation. I have called IDOT and reached out to the head of IDOT multiple times. And the response that I've gotten from IDOT is, well, we don't want to do anything because there's still a federal investigation pending, which signals to me that IDOT knows full well there were people within their organization who are also being corruptly influenced in connection with this camera. And similarly, when I have spoken with the Democratic legislators, so many of whom previously had voted to just abolish red light cameras, now all of a sudden I'm being told, no, we can't hear your legislation. And I even narrowed the legislation to specifically say that, at the very least, give people who get dinged with a red light camera the ability to argue in court that this particular camera was installed in association with public corruption. And even then, the chairman of the Transportation Committee has refused to allow that bill to be called forward for a vote because they don't want to interrupt the revenue streams within the city of Chicago. So that's yet another example of how bad Chicago politics is adversely impacting our district. Another piece of legislation that I've drafted is called Emmett's Law. I don't know if any of you here in Elmhurst are familiar with it, but there was a student named Emmett who had issues, did not want to have to wear a mask in school in connection with COVID. And for punishment, he was essentially put in isolation at school for the majority, if not the entire day, locked in a room and had to do his classes by Zoom at the school. In connection with mask mandates. So, to me, this is just one area where, no matter what you think about the efficacy of students wearing masks in school, students shouldn't be forced, locked unsupervised on a Zoom call in a room for hours upon hours at a stretch. We actually had a huge scandal in Illinois in connection with students being with developmental disabilities or other issues or mental health issues being locked away in rooms and isolated for extended periods of time. And we said that we're not going to do that for those types of students, even if those students had a past history of violence. You certainly shouldn't be doing that for otherwise healthy kids like Emmett. Similarly, a lot of feedback that I've gotten from local parents is they are very unhappy when it comes to their kids' school curriculum. They're not seeing transparency. What they are getting an indication of, they don't like. So this is yet another area where, we should be telling schools that, particularly for certain types of curriculum that is actually actively discriminating against students based on their race or their gender, that has no place in our public schools, which should actually be committed to equality and equal opportunity for all. So again, I've filed over 100 different pieces of legislation. You can find them at ilga.gov. Click under my name, but that's also an area as well where you can find all sorts of different pieces of legislation that are happening, and certainly the ones that I'm filing. I do want to say I did have some legislative successes in connection with this prior legislative session. One of them related to an issue that's very near and dear to parents who have students who are trying to get into University of Illinois. It's very troubling to me that some of our top students can't manage to get into the University of Illinois, even though out-of-state students and foreign students seem to be able to find places. So I did get past HB 796, which is creating through our community colleges a uniform way to try to get into the University of Illinois, where basically if you maintained a certain GPA and you're in and you have a good record, essentially you can have guaranteed admission into the University of Illinois. Another piece of legislation related to students and mental health. One of the things that we found over the years is that the guidance counselors that you may have been familiar with in high school who would just kind of meet with you and tell you what classes to take. That's not really the type of counseling that our students are actually seeking. They're seeking, guidance in connection with family issues, with social issues, with health issues, with mental health issues. So HB 1719 was essentially a modernization of our school code relating to guidance counselors and school counselors, and recognizing that our counselors within our schools are actually taking on a much broader scope of advising roles with our students, and making sure that our school code is going to be supportive of that. And particularly, now that as we continue, into these areas of COVID, where it's very sad, but the suicides have been skyrocketing, mental health issues have been skyrocketing. It's now, important more than ever that our students are getting the full scope of support services that they need in our schools. There was one piece of legislation that has passed the House. It has not thus far gotten out of the Senate, but that's also relating to a higher ed issue. Again, we as parents, we're very concerned about the cost of higher education and particularly planning for it. This is actually instructing the state of Illinois at our 4-year and community public university level, and in conjunction with our community colleges, to create a $20,000 all-in capped degree program, so that no matter what, that you only have to spend $20,000 to make sure that your child can actually get a degree from a public institution in Illinois. And having that type of program, if you can then combine it with federal Pell Grants, which are usually around $3,000 to $3,500, state MAP grants for low-income students, which are in the $1,500 to $2,000 range, we can at least finally try to get students through school, through a higher education degree, without having a crushing debt burden by the time that they get out. One piece of legislation of mine that did get a hearing that I was actually very sad to see could not get passed is, we've seen a lot of activism behind the defund the police movement. And in a lot of that stems from, police officers and use of force. DuPage County has had historically excellent training of their law enforcement officers. And, I'm very proud that we don't have a lot of the same issues, again, that we've seen in Chicago. But one of the things that we have seen is a huge rise in civil lawsuits against law enforcement officers, including some law enforcement officers who really were just trying to do their job and protect the life of either themselves, their partner, or lives of our local residents. And HB 2467 was essentially a piece of legislation that said, listen, if you're going to go haul our law enforcement officers into court in connection with the use of force, but it turns out that use of force was in fact reasonable to protect either the officer's life or the life of another, then at the very least, can you please repay the officer their attorney fees? And that was a bill that every Republican voted yes, and the Democrats voted it down. So, that again just goes to show where priorities are when it comes to supporting good law enforcement activity that is in fact trying to reasonably keep people safe. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Coming up in the spring session here in 2022, we're actually having a very shortened session this year. Normally, we go from January until the end of May because we have to get a budget passed in theory by May 31st. This year, we've got a shortened session. A lot of the Springfield dates have already been canceled because of COVID. We've continued to do committee hearings through Zoom, but unfortunately, now there's also been a lot of voting through Zoom as well. When it comes to this spring session, because we've got a redistricting year, because there's a primary in June, Senate President Don Harmon, he basically said that he expects this upcoming legislative session to be clean up some of the things that we screwed up before. And that's not his exact words. I've got the exact quote here, but also, and just try to get a budget passed. So, and I do want to say that the budget process is going to be very interesting because, over the course of the last couple budget cycles, we have used the money that we've been getting from the federal government to fill in state budget holes. And, it's really easy to balance a budget when you have $42 billion in expenditures, $39 billion in revenue, but then the federal government gives you $13.5 billion. Once that federal government money goes away, you still have an upside down, balance in terms of your proposed budget. And hopefully the Democrats are going to be willing to work with people to do a little bit more common sense budgeting this time around. All right, let's go ahead and actually one of the legislative fixes that we did just go down to Springfield to deal with. This is another issue where, how should I put this? I discussed the criminal justice reform bill, criminal justice legislation that was passed during the lame duck session. There were a whole host of provisions that we at the time said, this is not going to be workable in the real world. And our voices were ignored. It passed with the thinnest of margins. Well, now all of a sudden, the sponsor of the original bill is starting to realize, they actually weren't joking. There really are a whole host of things that really aren't going to be able to work. HB 3512 was a supposed effort to try to, get this to do a fix. But unfortunately, we're still in a situation where it's still going to be a procedural nightmare and mess, and it's going to be very difficult for law enforcement to actually implement. So there again, but I do expect that we're going to see a similar set of bills relating to these types of issues. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Some issues that we are hoping are going to be brought up. In Illinois, there was a scandal for many years because the legislative inspector general was never appointed. After that finally came to light and, Madigan got bad PR from it, we finally were able to get an actual legislative inspector general. However, she has now resigned because she has said true ethics reform is not a priority. So during the last legislative session, Republicans were trying to negotiate at the table with the Democrats over an ethics reform bill, which included legislators can't be lobbyists, that you would think that would be a no-brainer, but it is not, and a whole host of other issues. And, unfortunately, some of our ethics provisions got even more watered down. Some of them weren't strengthened the way in which they should have been. There were a few decent provisions in the bill, which is why I voted for it. But, as a general rule, there's a lot more that we can and should be doing when it comes to ethics. And unfortunately, those pieces of legislation that we passed, that our caucus has proposed, the Democrats just aren't interested. We did talk a little bit about the budget. Unemployment insurance. This is something that I am very worried about, particularly to the extent it's going to hit small businesses. In connection with COVID, our unemployment insurance trust fund is now $5 billion underwater. in terms of where it should be based on standard actuarial predictions in terms of usage and need. That money has to be replenished somehow. So there are some American Recovery federal funds that are available. Unfortunately, of the many billions that were given to the state, Governor Pritzker has routed them towards a whole host of various expenses. I would call that shell game budgeting. I'm sure he would disagree. But ultimately, there's really only a few $billions left of those funds that we started with. This strikes me as an area that rather than going out and imposing more taxes on small businesses, who are the ones where having to pay the unemployment insurance increases, it's hardest usually for them. No, that's still an issue that's being discussed, but it's certainly something that I'm advocating for. And then again, addressing rising crime. I do think it's interesting that as we start getting closer to a primary election, all of a sudden, and some of the negative consequences of the prior quote unquote reforms are starting to lead to more murders and more crime. I think Chicago had they've had some of the highest murders this past go around on record. And there's even a brazenness to it. One of the things that we've seen in our district, I mean, home burglaries in Hinsdale and Elmhurst, car burglaries, carjackings, shootings. I mean, a woman was shot outside the Oakbrook Hilton. I'm sure many of you saw the looting that happened at Oakbrook Mall. There was a shooting at Oakbrook Mall. There have been shootings in Westmont. And one of the things that's really interesting is that, I've heard from some of our law enforcement officers that when they actually can manage to find these people and arrest them, they always try to clarify, well, they try to, some of these people, the people who get arrested, try to apply the Cook County standards. And then they become very disappointed that all of a sudden they find out that they actually committed a crime in DuPage County, where thankfully our state's attorney, Bob Berlin, will in fact prosecute people for ripping off the mall. They will charge people for burglary, will charge people for assault and for the carjackings, and not just with a slap on the wrist type of criminal charge. So, that's an area where certainly I support our law enforcement efforts to keep our families, keep our neighborhoods safe. But, I think that just for, I hate to say it, purely electoral politics reasons, we are probably going to see something from the majority party. And hopefully they're going to come to the table and negotiate in good faith, because the crime rates that we're seeing right now, and certainly in DuPage County, are just not acceptable. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. One of the questions, actually, before I jump to this, one of the questions in the chat related to, did you support the full implementation of the Guidehouse final rate study? That actually has not yet come to the floor for a vote. So one of the things that I have certainly found is that when it comes to resolutions, certainly I am fully in support of providing services for individuals who have disabilities. DCFS, I think, are the one of the people who heads DCFS actually just was held in contempt of court because DCFS has not been doing the work that they need to do to try to get Illinois standards up to speed. But certainly when it comes to supporting people with developmental and intellectual disabilities, I know that one of the things that Illinois is Illinois is at the bottom when it comes to the dollars that actually go into the pockets of the providers who are actually providing the services. And yet we seem to lose all of the funds that start off on the appropriation side of the legislature through all sorts of layers of administrators. So to me, anything we can do to try to make sure that more, that funds, that market rates are actually getting into the hands of providers, as opposed to getting lost to administration. That's something, for administration that's not actually helping the individuals involved. Hopefully that's something that will also have bipartisan support. Because a lot of the questions that people called into the office or wrote into the office in advance related to COVID, I did want to give everybody a brief COVID update. So number one, Illinois Department of Public Health. They've not been making their data clear. They haven't been making their messaging clear in terms of what has actually been going on in terms of, on the ground statistics, so that people can make an actual informed decision. So number one, to me, when it comes from a public health perspective, our reported hospitalization data. I've been critical for some time that IDPH has not been clearly differentiating between people who are admitted to the hospital for COVID-19 versus people who are, once they are in the hospital at some point in time, test positive for COVID-19, or for people, like a gunshot victim comes to the hospital and they get tested for COVID-19 and found they're positive. Well, you haven't come to the hospital because you're COVID-19 positive. You've come to the hospital because you're a gunshot victim. Locally in DuPage, though, one of the things that we have been seeing, DuPage does have an over 70% vaccination rate, where somebody has gotten at least one dose of the vaccine. I think it's around 63, 65% when it comes to, I think both doses. And what I've been told in terms of our local hospital numbers is they're seeing about 30 to 40% of individuals currently who are hospitalized have been vaccinated, 60 to 70% have been unvaccinated. Other states are starting to make changes in how they report data. I'm hoping Illinois is going to follow their lead. I actually like looking at statistics from the United Kingdom because they're much more clear in terms of not only what their standards are, but how they how they're categorizing patients for data trend analyses. We are seeing staff shortages as well as COVID infections and associated quarantines at our hospitals, and that is leading to staffing shortages. So I don't want to downplay that, COVID-19 infections are continuing to be a real problem. Some of the things, though, that I would say you can do. So there was a report that came out today, that's identifying some of the, in terms of who are the most at risk when it comes to COVID, obviously based on your age, obesity, having, 2, 3, or 4 comorbidities. If that's you, you are a patient at risk, and, you should certainly be following the advice from your doctor. But if you're not currently infected and you haven't yet been infected, aside from following the other guidance from your doctors, one thing that I have heard over and over again is do everything you can to boost your immune system, healthy diet, exercise, weight loss if you're overweight. And again, I am myself an overweight middle-aged mom. So, I understand that can be hard, but adequate sleep, rest, staying hydrated, making sure that you are getting a full dose of vitamins, especially vitamin C, vitamin D, all of these types of things, can basically try to reduce stress on your existing immune system, so that if you do, get exposed in a way that viral load isn't going to overtake your immune system and put you at risk. However, if you do become infected, I have what I've been, and actually just before I started this webinar tonight, I was on a webinar involving the Elmhurst Edwards Hospital and DuPage County Health Department and the Heart Group, which is looking at healthcare equity in DuPage. And if we can go to the next slide, there are a lot of treatment options that are out there. The one thing that I would say, and I hear this over and over and over again from our physicians, is if in fact you test positive, please alert your primary care physician immediately, because there are many treatment options that are out there, whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated. There are treatment options that are out there where the timing of when those treatments are administered can have every impact in the world as to, is it effective or is it not? Now, some of the new therapeutics that have recently come out on the market, most of these are in conjunction with what are called emergency use authorizations from the FDA. Sutrova, that is a monoclonal antibody from GSK. It's given by infusion. This again, monoclonal antibodies, they are not for everybody, but in particular, this one is most indicated if you are considered to be a high risk patient. And the high risk patients, those are people, again, you have multiple risk factors, usually over the age of 65 or 75. There's different tier structures in terms of who's eligible for that. But, because supplies are limited, the physicians are really trying to, keep the focus on, where is this going to do the most good for our high risk patients to try to prevent hospitalization and death. There are other, Paxlovid is out there. That's actually an oral dose therapy. So if that's something that your doctor may be able to prescribe to you over the counter, possibly even without an office visit. There's a new drug from Merck, another antiviral. You might that's one that's kind of a little bit farther down in the tier in terms of efficacy. There's steroids that are available, but those are ones where that's more if your disease has progressed, you're having difficulty breathing, shortness of breath. So, there are treatment options available, but again, you have to be in contact with your doctor to make sure that you know exactly what options are available for you. And if you don't have a doctor, most of our local hospitals, certainly with Amita, Elmhurst Edwards, they actually do have COVID hotlines that you can call. And if you call, and if you know somebody who tests positive and maybe they don't have a primary care physician, certainly if there's, for whatever reason, call those hotlines so that you can get a quick referral so that you actually do have someone who can take care of you and monitor how you're doing. Everybody should be taking vitamin C, vitamin D. If you have a fever, definitely, Tylenol, ibuprofen is still part of the standard of care. But also make sure as well, one of the best things that you can buy if you are able to afford it and you have it available if you test positive for COVID is a pulse oximeter. You can buy them cheap on Amazon. Basically, use them to monitor your blood oxygen levels. If you drop below 95% pretty consistently, that's a cause for concern. If you're at 92%, head to the emergency room or seek urgent care immediately because those are dangerously low levels and can be indicative that your viral infection may in fact be progressing. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So one of the things that I did ask is, again, I would just like to encourage everyone, if you can throw questions into the chat box below on Zoom or on the Q&A so that we can try to get to as many of your questions as possible. And also, if you are on Facebook, I'm getting told that there's a little bit of a glitch, but please go ahead and try to put questions in the comments so that we can move them forward. One of the questions I know, Ed, I have not forgotten about you. I would like, if I made it, I'll introduce everybody who's on the call. Ed is a champion for a piece of legislation relating to property taxes. One of the things that he experienced is lives in an HOA association and didn't realize that one of his neighbors had filed a property tax appeal challenging the assessor's monetary value. That somebody else in his neighborhood was in fact successful getting their property tax valuation reduced, which of course has the ultimate impact of lowering their property tax bill. But by the time Ed found out about it, the time to actually file a property tax appeal for that year was too late. So we have drafted, Ed had some legislation. Actually, my predecessor tried to get it moving. I've tried to get it moving. So the first year we tried to get it through the Judiciary Committee. Finally got a hold of the chairman and couldn't believe that the bill had been sitting around for so long, but he didn't want to actually have the bill move unless the Cook County assessor, Fritz Kagi, said that it was okay. So then we started reaching out to the assessor's office, and the assessor says, well, this is really a revenue issue, so we want to make sure that the chairman of the revenue committee thinks it's okay. So that's Mike Zaleski. And I run it by Mike Zaleski, and he says, well, I need to have our staff look at it. I need to have I need to have Fritz Kagi opine on it. And Kagi kicked it over him. Then, they kick it back to the Cook County assessor. Then everybody referred it over to the Democratic staff. Democratic staff won't actually even give feedback on the particular piece of legislation. But the chairman has essentially said, the last time I spoke to him about it, which was in Springfield last week, that property tax bills are just not going to be moving for the foreseeable future. So this is an area where what should be a fairly uncomplicated piece of legislation simply can't get traction because the committee chairs within the committee, they just won't be interested in it. And the way in which it works down in Springfield is every single piece of legislation that gets filed goes to what's called the Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee, every bill, I refer to the Rules Committee as the boneyard where bills go to die. So you can't move any particular piece of legislation until the Rules Committee decides they're going to release it to a committee. But even once it gets released to a committee, you can't even necessarily call your bill for discussion unless the committee chair agrees. And even if the committee chair agrees, maybe you might even get a vote on it. That still is not enough actually for a piece of legislation to get a vote on the floor. Then the speaker, the House's staff has to actually agree that you can call your bill on the floor. So there's many of the pieces of legislation that we have, simply through inertia, disinterest, that these pieces of legislation can't even manage to move. So that's another area as well where the Springfield process can be very discouraging, because you can have a piece of legislation like the one that Ed has been valiantly advocating for and trying to move, and I've been trying to help him. And, when you get down to Springfield, you start running into, I don't know, I'm not interested in this, I'm not interested in that, maybe not. You can't get anybody to commit to anything. Your legislation simply can't move. And that's the downside of the fact that, when you're in the minority party as well, that the majority party isn't interested in moving it. But again, even for pieces of property tax legislation that's also common sense that would help our disabled veterans, the Democrats have been unwilling to move that legislation as well. So, this Springfield, it's a long process. It's a frustrating process. But that's one of the reasons why I am down there, is to try to keep pushing on various issues and see how things are going to go. Let me follow up with another question. Shouldn't there be a strong recommendation for folks to get vaccinated? I think that when you look at the vaccination data, there is definitely data that in the aggregate suggests that vaccination can be helpful for certain people. There are other patient populations, though, where use of a vaccine has been contraindicated and not necessarily, or hasn't been approved. And not only for certain children under certain ages, but also older people. So, for example, if you are taking certain biological drugs for rheumatoid arthritis, that makes you an immunocompromised person. That's not someone where the medical literature is currently recommending you get a vaccine. So these are all areas where one of the reasons why I have not particularly been behind mandates is because these are areas where I believe that people should be making decisions in conjunction with their doctor and their health and a whole host of other issues. So, I think that if you look at DuPage County as a whole, we are actually one of the highly vaccinated counties throughout the state of Illinois. But I do just hope that everyone decides to be sensitive to the fact that, for some people, it isn't always just a cut and dry issue. Some of the other questions that I have gotten, how do we stop Pritzker mandates? Is there any willingness to rein in Pritzker? I think that there's been a concern, and Democratic legislators have actually expressed this as well, behind the scenes when they're not on record, that Governor Pritzker, we're now in essentially year 2 of issuing emergency executive orders. So the legislature has met multiple times. We've gone through a full legislative season. And, this is an area where I think when it comes to matters of public policy and public health, This is an area where the legislature should be the ones stepping up and setting policy and then relying on the executive to actually carry that policy out. That's the way that things are supposed to work. Instead, what we've seen, and this is not a problem, unique to Illinois, we've also seen it at the federal level as well, where, the administrations are simply ignoring the legislators, doing what they want. And, it makes people, I think, very unhappy about the process because when it comes to any piece of legislation, win or lose, at least if you've gone through the legislative process, you feel that you've had an opportunity to participate, you've had an opportunity to be heard, and maybe you can take the fight on, another day. When everything is being done through executive orders and subject to, in our court system, what's referred to as an arbitrary and capricious standard, which is a very difficult threshold to challenge, I think that actually leads to people not having as much confidence and faith in what administrations are doing, precisely because the due process part of it, the legislative process, they've been cut out of it. And, this again is an area where, unfortunately, the Illinois House procedural rules make it very difficult for any legislator, Republican or Democrat, to try to bring some control or guidance over what the Pritzker administration is doing. Because here again, we're in a situation where if you want to have your piece of legislation called to the House floor, the Speaker of the House has ultimate decision-making authority as to whether it can be brought or it can't be brought. So when you're the Illinois Speaker of the House and you're a Democrat and you are wanting to support your Democratic governor, there's really not a lot of incentive to do anything. This is an area where I actually think that a little more divided government down in Springfield would be a healthy thing, because you would at least make sure that, more sides and more opinions and more stakeholders are actually having a say and getting a hearing in the process. So this is yet another area where, and also too, this is an area as well where partisan politics does come into play. Certainly when it came to the Right of Conscience Act, there were many Democrats I spoke to who actually did not like what the governor was doing, and they either abstained, or once they saw that Robin Gable had the votes for it, then they flipped their votes so that they could curry favor with the governor. But that again is another area where it's unfortunately it's not necessarily the way to get great policy. We've certainly got a lot of questions in, and there's also some in the chat box in the Q&A relating to crime. There's crime spillover into DuPage from Cook County. We've certainly seen crime rates going up. What can be done legislatively? I have multiple pieces of legislation that try to target some of these issues, and some of them not only relate to actually making sure that we've got enforcement of our existing laws and not tying the hands of our judges and not tying the hands of our law enforcement officers who are trying to actually go after and stop criminal activity. But we also need to really take a careful look at our state's attorneys. So, one piece of legislation that I have, I don't know if any of you have heard about Kim Fox, but Kim Fox is the Cook County State's Attorney. And Anita Alvarez, who was previously in that role, she actually was, trying to prosecute a lot of crimes. We've seen a different philosophy when it comes to Kim Fox's office. Her felony review group is not approving prosecutions the way that they should. They're not even filing the motions for cash bail the way in which they should be filing them under current law. So that all has downstream impacts because when you really do start looking at the crime statistics, repeat offenders are disproportionately responsible for a large amount of criminal activity. And, so if you've got the repeat offenders and you're refusing to lock them up and, they're out there, they have the ability to go out and commit even more crimes. One piece of legislation that I filed, I think it's very interesting that the Democrats want to split up DuPage County. But when it comes to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, so unlike, so even if you look at New York City, they don't just have a New York City DA's office. There's a Manhattan DA's office, a Bronx, Staten Island. All of the different boroughs have their own state's attorneys, so that or their own prosecutors, so that they can tailor things more locally based on situations on the ground. Well, why not take the existing judicial subcircuits in Cook and let them have their own, deputy state's attorney who can make these types of charging decisions, prosecution decisions, so that at the very least, people can feel more safe within their neighborhoods. So that's yet again another area where the Democrats are interested in carving up DuPage, but they're not interested in curbing the power of Kim Foxx, even if it means it's going to lead to more criminal charging and less crime overall. Another question another issue that came up is, I get this a lot, which is why are people fleeing Illinois? So in the 2020 census, Illinois, they lost enough population to lose a congressional seat. And that means that we're going to have less of an impact at the federal level as well. So we declined by a record, but even since the census, we've declined by a record 113,776 residents just between July 2020 and July 2021. And that was in the most recent estimates from December 21, released by the U.S. Census Bureau. Only New York and California had worse numbers. Interestingly, when you look at DuPage County, what are the areas where our residents are primarily going? They're going to Florida, they're going to Tennessee, they're going to Texas, they're going to Arizona. Lower tax jurisdictions, jurisdictions where you're seeing more economic growth. So in terms of why are people, fleeing Illinois, I think a lot of it is just bad governance at the state level. Certainly, I don't think anybody's looking at Chicago right now and viewing it as a model of good governance. But I think that you're just seeing a lack of trust that people have in their government, that they're actually going to do the right thing. They're going to be protective. They're going to follow the law. They're going to respect people as individuals. It's, our state's policies recently have been geared towards what I refer to as the political activist insider class, not necessarily towards, people who are just trying to do a good job, support their families, make a living. They just want safe streets. They want good schools. They want to be able to live a normal life. And and it's sad that so many people are looking at Illinois and not seeing that for them. But I do think that we can reverse the trend. It's in terms of Illinois trying to get back on the right track, I think we do need to have a much more transparent government. We need to have a governor who's willing to be more transparent and not just keep, issuing executive orders that are disrupting people's lives. One of the pieces of legislation that the Democrats enacted and the governor signed was giving the Chicago Teachers Union more authority and power to strike. And the CTU knows they have that authority. They just got that new authority. And what are they doing? The more power that they get, well, now, over 330,000 students and their parents or legal guardians' lives were just completely thrown into chaos in connection with the Chicago Teachers Union vote that just got taken. And again, if the schools, just to be clear, the schools and particularly Chicago, they got millions of dollars, both, from the state and from the Fed to try to, do COVID, related countermeasures to make sure the schools are more safe, improve ventilation, and to get ready for all of this. So to see this happening, is really troublesome. And what was particularly troubling as well was to then, I think it was in the news recently where a Chicago Teachers Union member was apparently arrested at O'Hare trying to get on a flight to Florida. I won't go into the details of the reason why they were arrested, but I do think it's rather ironic that the CTU, having insisted that they want to, keep the Chicago schools closed, which is hugely damaging, particularly if you care about, low-income minority students, who keep falling behind and have fallen way behind in connection with online learning and what happened last year. For somebody to then turn around and hightail it to Florida, it just, like I said, not good governance. When it comes to, in terms of what Illinois needs to do to get back on the right track, just get back to normal and have honest government, have transparent government, have ethical government. And, now I personally think that's going to need, we're going to need to see a change in government. We're going to need to see, but ultimately you have to get back to government 101. You have to keep your streets safe and clean, keep your schools open and running, deliver value for the money that you're taking from your taxpayers, and people will be supportive of their government. But, I really haven't found many people in Illinois who think that for all of the high taxes, whether it's property taxes, income taxes, the other sales taxes, the whole laundry list of taxes that we pay in Illinois, that they really think they're getting great value for the dollars that they send to Springfield. And, and that's something that it has to be, we've got to just get back to making sure that we do have a government of the people for the people, and quit assuming that a particular political interest group is somehow reflective of, what normal people really want in their day-to-day lives. Let me keep going through some of the questions here. Let's see. Okay. I made sure I got that one. Let's see. And, education. A lot of parents have reached out to me, and I'm the parent of students who are in the public schools, and I've experienced a lot of the same frustrations. They are really not happy with what is going on in their kids' classrooms. This is one where I fundamentally believe parents have a right to control their students' education. Parents need to be consulted and allowed to participate in the process relating to curriculum. When parents object to curriculum in their classrooms that their students are being exposed to, that needs to be taken seriously. And it's very sad that I've seen in a lot of our high schools, a lot of our elementary schools, junior highs, that we have very disinterested boards when it comes to the wants and needs of our parents, that you have administrators and teachers who are, who are given a considerable position of trust by our parents and a considerable amount of money too. In Elmhurst, I think our average cost per student is around $16,000 in terms of expenditures. Hinsdale, I think it's over $20,000 per student. Chicago, look at those outcomes. I think they're spending $27,000 per student. That's one of the highest in the state. And they've got terrible educational outcomes. So I think that that's an area where our local schools need to be doing better. But I also want to reemphasize as well that part of this is also being driven by, at the state level, rejiggering our learning standards in a way that is not actually putting our students on a pathway towards learning knowledge and achieving excellence, but is actually watering down our curriculum and not ensuring that our students actually have the critical information that they're going to need, not only to progress from grade to grade, but to ultimately be successful adults. So, one of the buzzwords that is getting heard a lot and getting thrown around a lot is critical race theory. I think a lot of people hear that term and they hear the term critical. So they kind of think like, oh, well, that's just teaching critical thinking. It's actually not. And it's been demonstrated that when that becomes the dominant paradigm in terms of what students are learning, it actually leads to worse student outcomes. And parents don't like it, students don't like it. And I think it's very interesting that when you talk to some of the teachers unions at the Washington, D.C., at the federal level, their first step is, well, we're not teaching critical race theory. And then their second argument is, well, you should be glad we're teaching critical race theory. And then the third backstop argument becomes, well, you may think it's critical race theory, but you can't prove we're actually doing that in the classrooms. Usually when you have someone getting that defensive about it, it means you are doing it and you're not being open and honest and transparent with parents about it. And if parents don't want to see that in their local classrooms, they shouldn't have to. So I actually do have some pending legislation on that as well. But I also would encourage any parents who are concerned about this issue to please reach out to me at my office because we do actually have some tools existing under state law that you can use to start to fight back against this in your child's classroom if this is curriculum that you're seeing and you don't want it for your child. Okay, so I'm going to make since we're already 15 minutes over, I am going to make one last call for questions. Either throw them into the Q&A, preferably throw them into the Q&A. Sorry, I'm just checking my phone to make sure that if anybody else has texted me some questions, that I've made sure to get some of those. I think I've caught all of those. But yeah, ultimately, I do want to say again, thank you everybody so much for joining us here tonight. If there were any questions that you have that we didn't, for whatever reason, get to, or if you need some more follow-up or more clarity, that would be fantastic. I do want to say the process down in Springfield, it is long, arduous, and frustrating, but there are some good things that we can hopefully get done for our state so that we can have a more safe and prosperous Illinois. I would encourage anybody, if you want to reach out, phone is always easy, 630-852-8633. You can also email at mazzochi@ilhousegop.org. So my last name at ilhousegop.org. And also please do feel free to check out our website. I do try to post things at Mazzochi, www.repmazzochi.com, pretty timely. We also are trying to keep you updated as well as we can in real time through Facebook. You can also find like floor speeches there and other things that I'm doing down in Springfield. And also too, I really would encourage everyone, if you're willing, please sign up for our district e-newsletter. You can also sign up there at repmazzochi.com. That is something where we try to do something pretty in-depth on a fairly regular basis to keep you informed on what's going on in Springfield, the things that I'm working on, and also too events that we do here in the district. We've done all sorts of programming on a whole host of issues, not only these town halls, but on property tax issues, mental health issues, COVID, also government services, things for seniors, job fairs. And if there are any particular issues that you do want to make sure you can learn about, we also did a session recently for first generation college students. You're heading off to, you want to apply to college. What do you need to know? We do have a whole host of resources that are available to you. We're happy to share. And, also too, anytime you find, you're struggling with state government, it could relate to, you have an issue with professional licenses. Maybe something's not happening at your county or local or township level. Maybe you're finding, you're hitting a wall at the federal level, with your congressman, and you want to find something. Again, reach out to our office because we've really been able to sometimes cut through the bureaucratic red tape and try to get people some help and relief, or at the very least, like I said, a phone number for a live human being who can actually get your questions answered. So again, thank you so much, everybody, for participating tonight. I do hope that you're going to keep in contact with us at the office, and hopefully the next time we have a town hall, we're not going to have to do it through Zoom. We're going to be able to do it live and in person, and I will very much enjoy seeing all of your faces face to face. So thank you so much, everyone. And again, we have here on the slide phone number, email, website. Please sign up for the newsletter so that we can make sure we keep in contact with you as much as possible. Thanks so much, everyone.